On August 16, 1977, Elvis Presley passed away at the age of 42, and millions of people all over the world went into mourning. But almost as soon as the news broke, rumors started that he faked his death and went into hiding.
Elvis's death on August 16, 1977 left the world in mourning, but some believe it was all part of a grand plan to escape the pressure of fame. It sounds unbelievable, but the rumors have persisted for decades, and now Pastor Bob himself is finally addressing them. Is this a new turn to Elvis's story? And if it's true, why did he stay hidden for so long? The legend lives on. Let's start with something we all know. Elvis Presley was a man with unforgettable looks, high cheekbones, a chiseled jawline, and those arched eyebrows. Now here's where it gets interesting. Take a close look at Pastor Bob Joyce. Notice anything familiar? His face almost feels like a mirror reflecting Elvis in a different time. It's like looking at an older version of the king himself. But let's not just rely on vibes here. Side-by-side photos have surfaced all over the internet, and the resemblance is enough to make even skeptics pause. Same prominent chin, same eyebrow arches, and that same regal presence that made Elvis a cultural icon. You've got to admit, it's pretty wild. Is it just a coincidence? Now let's talk about their build. If you lined them up, they could practically share the same tailor. Both Elvis and Pastor Bob stand tall at 6 feet and 1 inch with a similar broad-shouldered, commanding physique. And here's a quirky little detail. Their shoe size. Both wore a size 11. Now, plenty of people wear size 11, but add that to the pile of similarities. Just imagine this scene. Elvis slipping off his blue suede shoes, trading them for something a little more low-key, like a pastor's black leather loafers. It's a simple image, but it fits the narrative like a glove, or in this case, like a shoe. And then there's the teeth. Yes, teeth. You wouldn't think something as mundane as dental work could be a smoking gun, but here we are. Back in his prime, Elvis had a slight gap in his front teeth. He eventually had it fixed with dental caps, because of course even the king had to keep up appearances. Now, when you look at Pastor Bob's teeth, they resemble Elvis's post-dental work smile. The shape, the alignment, even the way they catch the light, it's uncanny. Some fans have gone full detective mode, zooming in on old and new photos to compare. And here's the kicker. Reports suggest Pastor Bob's dental work happened a few years after Elvis's death. Could that be a coincidence? Maybe. Or could it be the king's second act? But let's not get carried away just yet. Sure, connecting the dots is easy when you're looking at photos and comparing shoe sizes and teeth, but even skeptics can't ignore how all these little details seem to fall into place. It's like solving a jigsaw puzzle where every piece just happens to fit. Still, some argue it's all in our heads, a case of wanting so badly for Elvis to still be alive that we start seeing him in every face that bears a passing resemblance. But what if it's not just hopeful thinking? What if these clues are more than coincidences? Can a face, a build, and a set of teeth tell the whole story? Or is there something even more compelling waiting to be uncovered? Because if you think their physical similarities are shocking, wait until you hear the voice that ties it all together. Could it be the unmistakable sound of the king himself? The voice match. Literally, this is where the story takes a turn into spine-tingling. Elvis's voice was his signature. A deep, velvety tone wrapped in a southern accent that could melt hearts and stir souls. And guess what? People who've heard Pastor Bob sing say his voice carries that same magic. Coincidence? Maybe. Pastor Bob often leads his congregation in gospel music. Now, gospel wasn't just something Elvis dabbled in. It was his haven. It's where he found peace in the chaos of fame. So, when Pastor Bob sings those same spiritual tunes, people can't help but draw comparisons. Imagine sitting in a church pew, listening to Pastor Bob pour his heart into a hymn, and suddenly feeling like you're back in the 70s hearing the king himself. It's not just the tone, it's the emotion, the raw connection that leaves listeners frozen in awe. One fan described it perfectly. When I close my eyes and hear Pastor Bob sing, it's like Elvis is in the room. Another chimed in, saying, "The way he holds those notes gives me chills. No one else sings like that except Elvis." Skeptics might roll their eyes, but even they admit the resemblance is hard to ignore. Now let's talk about the technical stuff. Tone, pitch, and emotion. Elvis had a way of pulling you into a song, making you feel every word. His voice was smooth yet powerful, tender but commanding. According to those who've heard him, Pastor Bob has that same gift. Whether it's a soulful hymn or an upbeat gospel tune, he sings with a passion that feels eerily familiar. Some experts have even analyzed recordings of both voices, noting striking similarities in vocal range and timbre. It's not just about how they sing, but what they sing. In his later years, Elvis often turned to gospel music, finding solace in its spiritual messages. Pastor Bob's collection also heavily leans into the gospel. The comparisons don't stop at performances. When Pastor Bob speaks, his southern drawl has a cadence that reminds fans of Elvis in casual interviews. Think about Elvis sitting down for one of his charming, off-the-cuff chats, speaking warmly. Now picture Pastor Bob delivering a sermon. It's like two sides of the same coin. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Voices can sound similar. Plenty of people might have a natural resemblance in tone or style, but here's where things get weird. Fans have made side-by-side videos comparing Pastor Bob's gospel performances with Elvis's recordings. In these mashups, the transition between voices is seamless. You'd think it was the same person if you weren't watching. Creepy, right? And then there are the emotional reactions. People who grew up idolizing Elvis, who thought they'd never hear that voice again, have been moved to tears listening to Pastor Bob. "It's like he's back," one fan said, barely able to hold back their emotions. Another described it as a moment of pure déjà vu, as if time had rewound for just a few precious minutes. Even skeptics, known for their prove it or lose it attitude, have found themselves second-guessing. "Okay, it's weird," one said after hearing the recordings. "I still think it's a coincidence, but man, it's really strange." That's the thing about Pastor Bob's voice. It makes even the most logical minds pause. So, what does this all mean? Is it possible that Pastor Bob's voice is just a remarkable coincidence? Or is it the King's voice, reborn in a new life? While the skeptics debate and the believers cling to hope, one thing is clear. This mystery isn't going away anytime soon. But a voice is just one part of the story. What about the way they move, the way they act? Is Pastor Bob's body language another clue that Elvis might still be with us? The personality match. Let's face it, Elvis Presley had a way of commanding attention like no one else. When he stepped on stage, it was not just his voice that made people swoon. It was his gestures, his movements, the way his hands told a story even when the music stopped. Now, take a good look at Pastor Bob Joyce. Watch him preach. His hands move with the same energy as he's painting a picture in the air. It's the kind of thing you can't teach. You either have it or you don't. Fans have gone as far as creating slow-motion videos of both Elvis and Pastor Bob in action. One clip shows Elvis strumming his guitar, his fingers darting across the strings with effortless charm. Another shows Pastor Bob at the pulpit, his hands rising and falling with every heartfelt word. Watching these side by side makes it hard not to feel a shiver run down your spine. The gestures, the timing, even the flick of a wrist. It's like seeing a ghost of Graceland in a church sermon. Skeptics might say, come on, lots of people move their hands when they talk. Sure they do, but this isn't just about random hand movements. It's about the way these movements feel so natural, so Elvis. It's as if his body language carried over into this new life, hidden in plain sight. And then there's the personality. Elvis wasn't just the king of rock and roll, he was also the king of charm. He had this way of making everyone feel like they were the most important person in the room. Friends described him as warm, funny, and surprisingly humble for someone who could have let fame go to his head. Now, listen to the way people talk about Pastor Bob. Words like gentle, kind, and down-to-earth pop up again and again. Members of his congregation say his sermons feel personal, like he's speaking directly to their hearts. One churchgoer said, when Pastor Bob cracks a joke during his sermon, it's like Elvis is up on stage again, making us laugh and feel at home. Humor is another key connection. Elvis had a funny streak, always ready with a quick one-liner or a playful joke. Pastor Bob, it seems, shares that same spark. His sermons are sprinkled with little jokes that catch the congregation off guard in the best way. It's not just about being funny, it's about knowing when to lighten the mood and when to make people smile. Of course, not everyone's convinced. Skeptics argue that these similarities are just the product of thinking. After all, plenty of people are warm and funny, plenty of people talk with their hands. But here's the thing, how many people have all these traits? The voice, the looks, the gestures, the personality. When you stack them up, the coincidences feel a little too perfect. And for the fans, it's not just about facts and figures, it's about the feeling. That gut instinct that says, "This man reminds me of someone I thought I'd never see again." It's emotional, it's personal, and it's impossible to shake once it takes hold. So what do you think? Are Pastor Bob's gestures and personality just happy coincidences? Or are they the fingerprints of a life once lived on the stage of Graceland? But there's one more piece to this puzzle, a timeline that raises more questions than answers. The timeline twist. Timing is everything, they say, and when it comes to Pastor Bob Joyce, the timing raises a few eyebrows. Let's start with the facts. Elvis Presley was pronounced dead on August 16, 1977. Just 4 years later, in 1981, Pastor Bob Joyce began his public life as a preacher. 4 years. That's not enough time to disappear, reinvent yourself, and start a new chapter. Or is it? Think about it. Elvis was one of the most famous people on the planet. The pressure, the constant attention, it was crushing. What if he decided to take control of his own narrative? What if he staged his death, stepped away from the blinding lights, and chose a quieter, more meaningful path? If that's what happened, it explains a lot. But it also makes you wonder, why a pastor? Of all the things Elvis could have done, why pick a life in ministry? To answer that, let's go back to Elvis's roots. He is remembered as the king of rock and roll, but his heart belonged to gospel music. He grew up singing hymns in church, and the gospel was his refuge even at the height of his fame. It wasn't just music to him, it was a way to connect with something bigger, something sacred. Some of his most emotional performances were gospel songs, where you could see him pour his soul into every note. Now see this. Elvis overwhelmed by fame, longing for peace. What better way to find it than through faith? He wouldn't just sing gospel music as a pastor, he'd live it. He'd share it with others, not from a stage at Graceland, but from a humble pulpit. It's almost poetic, isn't it? The king of rock and roll traded his crown for a Bible, choosing a life of service over stardom. But here's where it gets interesting. Pastor Bob's rise as a preacher wasn't flashy. It was quiet, almost like he wanted to slip under the radar. Yet, for those who believe the theory, the timing feels too perfect to ignore. 4 years after Elvis's death is just enough time to mourn publicly, step out of the limelight, and reinvent yourself. Of course, skeptics argue it's nothing more than a coincidence. People change careers all the time, they say. But believers see it differently. They point to Elvis's love of the gospel, his faith, and his longing for a simpler life as signs that this wasn't random. It was deliberate. A carefully planned rebirth, if you will. Now let's address the elephant in the room. If Elvis really wanted to escape fame, why not choose something less public than being a pastor? Wouldn't that just invite more attention? Not necessarily. Think about it. Being a pastor isn't about fame. It's about community. It's about helping others, one small congregation at a time. In many ways, it's the opposite of being a celebrity. And for Elvis, it makes sense. He wasn't just a performer, he was a deeply spiritual person. He often talked about wanting to give back, to do something meaningful with his life. Becoming a pastor could have been his way of doing that without the chaos of the entertainment world. It's a story that feels almost too perfect. But isn't that what makes it so intriguing? So what's the truth? Is Pastor Bob's timeline just a coincidence? Or is it the final puzzle piece, the clue that connects Elvis's old life to his new one? But there's one more thing to consider. What do skeptics have to say? And why, despite their arguments, does this theory refuse to go away? Let's check out the ultimate showdown between believers and doubters. The skeptics versus believers. The debate is as fiery as one of Elvis's classic performances when it comes to the idea that Pastor Bob Joyce is actually Elvis Presley. Skeptics and believers are locked in a tug-of-war, each side armed with arguments they swear prove their case. So let's break it down. Who's winning this battle for the truth? Or at least, the better story? First, let's hear from the skeptics. Their biggest weapon? The numbers. Elvis Presley was born in 1935, making him nearly 90 today. Pastor Bob, however, claims he was born in 1952, a 17-year gap that's hard to explain. Skeptics argue it would be nearly impossible to convincingly fake such a massive age difference. People age differently, they say, but 17 years isn't something you can just hide. And then there's the challenge of faking a death. Imagine pulling off a stunt where the entire world believes you're gone. Skeptics point to the logistics, the medical records, the autopsy, and the grieving family. It's a fantasy, they argue, to think someone as famous as Elvis could disappear without leaving a trail. And yet there's that nagging feeling. What if? Believers, on the other hand, aren't backing down. They've got their own set of counterpoints, starting with a theory that gets more fascinating the deeper you dig. Some claim Elvis might have altered official documents, changing dates and details to create a brand new identity. And when it comes to appearance, cosmetic surgery. Let's not forget that Elvis was no stranger to altering his look even during his lifetime. Why not take it a step further? One of the most striking arguments from believers comes from something you can't quite measure: emotion. People who've seen Pastor Bob preach or heard him sing describe a deep, almost spiritual connection. It's not just the voice or the face, one fan said. It's the way he makes you feel like Elvis never really left. For believers, this isn't just a theory, it's a chance to hold on to a piece of the king. And then there's the mystery of Pastor Bob's behavior. He jokes about Elvis and even imitates him from time to time. Why do that if you're not him? Skeptics argue it's just a playful nod, but believers see it as a wink, a subtle way of saying, "You're right, but I can't say it out loud." Then there are the stories, like the one about Bob sitting in the front row of a private Memphis funeral, where Priscilla Presley herself placed a hand on his shoulder. Coincidence? Maybe. But it keeps the believers talking. Pastor Bob has reportedly released gospel songs that sound uncannily like Elvis's outtakes. Believers ask, how would he even have access to those recordings? And more importantly, how could he legally get away with it? The mystery keeps the theory alive, no matter how often skeptics try to shut it down. But let's step back for a moment. Why does this theory captivate so many people? Maybe it's not just about proving whether Pastor Bob is or isn't Elvis. Perhaps it's about something bigger, a longing for second chances, the idea that someone so beloved could escape the pressures of fame and find peace. Wouldn't it be comforting, believers ask, to know that Elvis didn't just vanish forever, that he's out there living a quieter, happier life? Even skeptics can't deny the emotional pull of that thought. So where does that leave us? Are the skeptics right? Is this just a wild fantasy fueled by nostalgia? Or are the believers onto something, piecing together clues that point to a secret life? Maybe the truth isn't just about evidence. Maybe it's about why this story matters to those who believe it. The king may have left the building, but his legend lives on. Is Elvis Presley dead or alive? Is this just one of the greatest unsolved mysteries kept by fans refusing to let Elvis go? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Are you a believer or a skeptic? Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and stay tuned for more exciting and unsolved mysteries.